everyone. Welcome to our next episode of the Glad Trad podcast. We have a special guest here today, Charles Coulombe. And as always, we're here with Jordan Pacheco as well. Thanks for tuning in. And before we get started here, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to our anonymous patron. You know who you are. And we just want to say we appreciate you.
You have a current book that's dropping in August about Karl, the Blessed Emperor Karl, who was blessed in the Catholic Church. It's called Blessed Emperor Charles: Legacy of a Holy Emperor. So this is about, of course, the Austrian emperor at the time of the First World War, who also was obviously a very saintly man.
Yes.
The last of the great Catholic monarchs ever for a while.
Very much so. For a while. Thus far. Thus far.
Thus far. Thus far.
I always say thus far because, you know, in history, remember between 476 and 800 and the year 800, when Charlemagne was crowned emperor in the West, that was a long time.
Mm-hmm.
So never say never in history.
That's the truth.
Nothing is ever exactly the same, but nothing is ever completely different.
So besides all these things, you are the first person ever, I'm serious about this, who I've ever heard describe themselves as a monarchist. And of course, to my and Rudy's American ears, they were set on fire immediately and we melted for a second.
Well, I've had that effect on people.
Yes. So what?
And that's even before they hear I'm a monarchist, they sometimes take a little ill, you know, sad.
You know, now that I've been, you know, that we've been into traditional Catholicism, it's not a bad word. It's not a bad word. And in fact, I describe myself as a closet monarchist, which means to say, like, I'm still trying to figure out the line of practical application and online LARPers, as I'm sure you've seen from time to time. And you've obviously erred to practical application. I've seen enough of your stuff. But maybe for the basics, for a lot of our audience that don't know, what does it mean to be a monarchist?
Well,
I know, right? The easy question.
I almost feel like saying, hi, I'm Charles, and I'm a monarchist. Hi, Charles, you know, monarchist anonymous, and so on. Well, how does one answer that question? Basically, what it means is that, at its broadest, because there's many types of monarchies as there are republics, as I'm sure you can guess. You know, it's just like democracy, which is a word that can mean a lot of different things. We used to say back in the 70s, that in the United States, we have a representative democracy. In the Soviet Union, they have people's democracy. And then Idi Amin declared that cannibalism was nutritional democracy.
Oh, finally.
So democracy could be what you want it to be. Republics, monarchies, these are all terms that have differing means. They mean different things to different people. But as the broadest possible sense of the word, it's rule by one man, generally, although not always, succeeding to his position through heredity. Now, I say generally, but not always, because there are elective monarchies. The Holy Roman Empire, for a long time, was one such. The Kingdom of Poland, Kingdom of Hungary, and, of course, the Holy See today is an elective monarchy. The Order of Malta, the Grand Master, is an elective monarch. So, it means basically rule by one man, but that obviously covers very, very little because, I mean, what's the difference between a monarchy and a dictatorship is the obvious question. What's the difference between monarchy and despotism? Well, it's a very good question. If we go back to people like Plato and Aristotle, they identified three types of government and then three perversions of them, if you will. Monarchy, ruled by one man, was considered to be a good thing, but tyranny, ruled by one man for his own purposes, was a bad thing. Aristocracy, ruled by a group of men, again for the purposes of for the common good, was considered a good thing, but oligarchy, ruled by a group by itself for its own use, was a bad thing. And lastly, what they called polity, or rule by the majority of stakeholders, not the majority of people, but the majority of, be it people who had served in the army, people who paid taxes, stakeholders. The majority of them, that was considered polity versus democracy, which was ruled by the mob for itself. Now, Aristotle was of the opinion, and St. Thomas and a lot of other people in the Middle Ages followed his idea, that the best kind of government was a mixed government, wherein you had a monarch, an aristocracy, and a polity, all sharing the governance of the realm. What I don't think he ever imagined was that today we'd be able to have the opposite, a set of government where you can have tyranny, oligarchy, and mob rule all at the same time. Yeah. So you see that actually never did come up for Aristotle. He had the opposites of the three kinds of good that he said mixed is best. He never came up with the idea of the mixed worst. That's something we've been able to invent in our own time, and I hope we're all proud of it. We should be. But seriously, having said all of that, what monarchy has come to mean, and the sense in which I take it, the Middle Ages, and I'm speaking now of Christian monarchy, because of course, one thing that all monarchies do have in common is a claim to some connection with the divine, however a given culture and its religion see that as being. So to this day, the Emperor of Japan is seen as the head of Shinto. In Thailand and in Bhutan, the king is the head of Buddhism in that country. And we're all familiar with the Islamic monarchies, where, functionally speaking, the king or the sultan is the head of the religion in his country. That's why, well, in Los Angeles, we have mosques that are endowed by the king of Saudi Arabia. We have a Buddhist temple endowed by the king of Thailand, because monarchy has come by our time. It's always bound up with the divine, however that given culture sees it. Well, Christian monarchy, as you might call it, really goes back to the 300s, when the first country became officially Catholic. That country was, drumroll please, Armenia. For all you people in Glendale.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, it was the very first Christian country, the first Christian kingdom, but a number followed very quickly thereafter. Ethiopia.
What does that mean, real quick, when you say the Christian kingdom? As in the king is the first to have adopted Christianity, or
precisely?
The people...
He adopted Christianity, and it became the state religion, the established faith. Now, there's something here I do have to say. It's a concept we really have to get down and understand. I'm going to say something very radical. We Americans are brought up to believe very deeply in what's called separation of church and state. And a lot of people argue back and forth over whether or not this is a good or a bad thing. I'm going to say something shocking to you. It is a non-existent thing. There is never a separation of church and state.
Heresy.
Yeah, I know. Well,
American heresy.
Well, there's a deep word I'm looking for. I know the word. Tough. That's it. Tough. Because you see, every regime has an animating philosophy that serves as a state religion. It gives legitimacy to the rulership. It determines the rules whereby either the game is played or people pretend to play it. So with the Soviet Union, it was communism. There is no God and Lenin is his prophet. And communism in the Soviet Union and under today in China and various other countries, Vietnam, Cuba, communism fit the place of a state church because a human society has to have one. It may not be called a church. It may not even be called a religion, but it exists. We have one in the United States. It's very hard to define because it's very vague. But if you break its principles, you'll be punished the way you'd be punished in any other society.
I wanted to, just very recently, I had a conversation with some family friends. And it's funny how America, which is supposed to be a post-Enlightenment Protestant nation, which has obviously had at times a very tepid history of Catholicism, and the nature of its Protestantism means that it kind of eschews the sort of religious iconography and artwork. Yeah. But it's been replaced, I think, with this kind of great American identity. So you look at the paintings of Manifest Destiny, or as my friend pointed out, they said, I don't want anyone here who doesn't worship the flag. And I kind of cocked my head to the side and said, well, that's kind of an interesting term, because if you say that in regular society, it doesn't pass as a sort of sacrilege or anything. So if you don't have God intimately tied with the nation state, it still will manifest, the divine worship and the practices as you see it will still manifest. How we salute, how we stand, how we don't burn the flag, all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And that's because you need that to have a country. You have to have an animating principle, as I say. In our case, you had this sort of generic Protestantism that was vague enough to encompass everybody from Episcopalians to Unitarians. Overlaying that was a sort of religion of the country, a civic religion, in which the president was sort of the high priest. The founding fathers were like the apostles. The Constitution was Holy Writ. The flag and the Liberty Bell and all that were holy relics. Then there were temples and shrines, Mount Vernon and the Lincoln Memorial, Bunker Hill, all these things. And they functioned together. With that was a sort of moral consensus, and that Catholics, Protestants, Jews all thought the same things were right and wrong. And this interesting mix basically worked from shortly after the Constitution was written. The American religion, I have to say, was actually put together very consciously by people like Noah Webster. They knew what they were doing, and they did it for a good reason. And the good reason was that prior to the Revolution, you had a very disparate population in each of the 13 colonies, each of which was very different from its neighbors,
right,
and internally was very strange and mixed. You see that in who the Loyalists were. Just as an example, in New England, because they were a minority, the Anglicans were usually Loyalists, and the Calvinists were rebel. Again, you'll find exceptions both ways, but by and large. In the South, it was reversed. There, where Anglicanism was the state church and they were dominant, they tended to be rebel. And the Calvinists, who were a minority and tended to be merchants and so on, they would tend to be loyalist. Well,
what about the Catholics in Pennsylvania? Where would we sit?
Well, like most other small minorities, they divided along, for want of a better word, class lines. The wealthier you were, the more integrated into society, the likelier you were to be a rebel. The poorer you were, or the more on the outs, the likelier you were to be a loyalist. And that wasn't just the case with us. You look at the Dutch in New York, the more assimilated you were, the more Anglo, if you will, the likelier you'd be a rebel. The more you retained your Dutch traditions and so forth, the likelier you were to be a Tory. There's one interesting case of a fellow, I forget his name now, and it's Dutch anyway, so I'd probably murder if I tried to pronounce it. But he was a Dutch New Yorker and had a position under the colony. After the Revolution, being a loyalist, he had to go to Canada. But then, in the 1790s, and he was still in government service up in Canada. But then in the 1790s, the British conquered the Cape from the Dutch. And suddenly they needed Dutch-speaking officials. So this fellow was transferred from Canada to South Africa.
Right. That's where he goes. Yeah.
And that's where he died. He ended up, his descendants are there still. But I mean, what a bizarre story. What a weird concatenation of circumstances. And that's what I love about history.
I want to back up because I remember Rudy was talking about this a couple of days ago. But does this mean, so just to back up to the very front, so as an American, and this is where a lot of us start on, as American, or that's what you think, then I think as you go into traditional Catholicism, obviously we understand the social kingship of Christ. It's something that's very, very important. But that also means that the M word, to be a monarchist, to believe in a king, isn't a horrible, outdated, archaic sort of thing. So why the question would be then, why would advocate for a system that's not the federal republic, right? What does monarchy have in terms of its institution that would make it more agreeable or better than having a republic, if that's the case?
All right. Well, let me back up just a minute. I'll finish your first question, then I'll move on to that. And to finish with your first question, the thing is that before the revolution, all these disparate groups had only one thing in common: that moral code I referred to and loyalty to the king. The revolution comes, the loyalty to the king is gone. So what do you replace it with? And that was why people like Noah Webster and all that created the religion of the country. And then as time has gone on, the Christian element has been slowly sucked out of it. And finally, in the 60s, that moral consensus was smashed. And the problem is that as the national religion slowly de-Christianized and then lost its moral foundation, it became sort of free-floating. Now, to move on to the question you just asked, well, there are several things going on at once. Firstly, it's important to bear in mind that most of what has made our federal republic successful was actually borrowed from the monarchy. All of our institutions, the sheriffs, the police, the city councils, the governors, all that stuff, and especially the common law, we got from the monarchy. We forget that. It's also important to bear in mind that the founding fathers who set the thing up were products of a monarchical culture, and they were the last generation to be so. People have often noted that we have never yet had a generation of statesmen as able and eminent as the founding fathers were. Mm-hmm. And they were the last generation of statesmen produced under the crown. Nobody ever seems to notice that. Basically, I would say that the problem with our system, and mind you, when Star Spangled Crown, I played with ideas. I must say at the outset that I have no idea of overthrowing the United States or bringing in a king or anything like that.
Well, now's the perfect time to do it.
Well, yeah, and now the streets are open.
Now the sheriff's expanded, you might as well.
Charles, it's okay. We can, we're in a safe space here. You could tell us the truth.
Well, I mean, this has got to be the lamest apocalypse ever. I swear. I mean, what if? Okay, you've got zombies. They're brain dead. We understand that. What if they've all got rubber teeth? Instead of biting you, it just kind of try to not gum you to death. It's so stupid. And the poor fellow who was murdered in Minneapolis is completely forgotten. And of course, the question that's asked is, how come I couldn't go to my aunt's funeral and he had a huge open air funeral? Mm-hmm. A lot of people are asking that kind of question.
Right.
And my great worry is that in destroying the instruments of law and order, the people who are doing so will bring down upon their heads, and that means all of our heads, just so you know. Mm-hmm. Would that it were just them. I have said for several years that they were sowing dragon's teeth. And I have prayed that it only affect them. But history being what it is, it'll affect us all. You keep pushing and pushing and pushing. If you tell people that loving America means you're a racist, you will create racists. If you tell people that resisting white supremacy means destroying businesses and pulling down statues, you will make white supremacists. You will do it. And the only person who's responsible at the end of it will be you yourselves. And when a bunch of morons start shooting up the joint in response to you, you can thank yourself. I hope you can face what you created bravely. One of the great, and this is completely off topic, but I gotta say, one of the great accomplishments of our country, and people think, oh, well, you're a monarchist, you must hate the United States. Au contraire, mon frère. Mm-hmm. I mean, I love this, I should say that country since I'm not over there right now. But I love that country so much, I agreed to die for it. And one of the great accomplishments of our nation, which I think is unparalleled in the pages of history, is that after the bloodiest and most horrible war we had ever fought, I mean the Civil War, the war between the states, the war of Northern Aggression, the war of the rebellion, call it whatever you want. 50 years after that thing ended, less than 50 years, 50 years after Gettysburg, they were able to have a reunion with old Confederates reliving Pickett's charge, running down the hill into the arms of the old Union veterans who had shot at them that day. And they threw their arms around them. Believe me when I tell you that America in 1913 was not a huggy place. You know, these were not good French Canadians like my people.
Oh,
no.
all right.
They were very standoffish. But that, to my mind, I mean, my earliest memories are the closing years of the Civil War centennial. And the bravery of both sides in battle was celebrated and so on and so forth, which is what you have to do if you want to reconcile two halves of a nation that's been split like that. Anywhere else in the world, that would have been a festering wound, like Ulster. But no, it was papered over, it was plastered over. And these morons have ripped it apart again. And there will be the devil to pay.
I seem to recall in Star Spangled Crown, there was a conversation about, so they bring in, of course, the is he the King of Lichtenberg or
is the Grand Duke of Lichtenberg?
Yes, Grand Duke of Lichtenberg, which doesn't exist but can be based loosely off of
oddly enough.
Yeah.
Oddly enough, it doesn't exist. Yes,
right. But I do remember that there was this emphasis inside his rule of uniting the people. So he would make emphasis that that while his ancestors were also with American ancestors at battles that they had never heard of. I think Colombe was one of them.
Colombe.
Yes. And so I think that what's funny is in the concept of monarchy, which might be different, what we're seeing now is that maybe this is your view, but with kind of the republic system that we set up, our leaders are really emphasized for one sort of people, whatever across the spectrum that people might be, because that's their electorate. That's their electorate. But as a monarchy, you are the monarch. You are the symbol of your nation state, and it's divinely appointed. So you have to be, in a way, patron of all your people, qua people. So the entire idea is unity in a way that it doesn't seem to exist inside our system.
Well, you can't really, because and again, talking once more about the kingship of Christ, which is very, very important, and bringing back the Catholic aspect. A Catholic king, and now we're being really sectarian here. Sorry about that. Although, to be fair, the notion does survive amongst, certainly amongst the Orthodox, and to a great degree, even among the Protestant kings. A king is trained to think of himself as being the vice regent, as it were, of God. Christ the King, Christus Rex, is the great exemplar. Now, mind you, that doesn't mean that every king is perfect or even that every king is pious. What it does mean is that that's the standard that's held up to them. Now, a president, on the other hand, is in kind of a weird position, specifically a president of the United States, because, on the one hand, he is supposed to be the leader of his party. There's an old joke that any president spends half his time trying to learn his job and half the time trying to get reelected. Inevitably, the people who voted against his opponent will, at the very least, feel a certain disaffection for him. It may not be overwhelming, but you're always hoping he'll make a mistake, so as the other party will get in, if you don't happen to like him, or be part of his party. Now, for the king, especially a king in what I like to call an executive monarchy, again, people have in mind absolute monarchies, Louis XIV, Henry VIII, so forth. On the one hand, those were, to my way of thinking, kind of corruptions in a way of the kind of monarchy I feel to be best. And on the other hand, none of them, not even Henry VIII, were nearly as absolute as the kind of government we live under now, which can determine that infants are not human beings and can change the nature of marriage. If Henry VIII had been a Supreme Court justice, he would have simply declared polygamy legal. And then he wouldn't have had to, off his wives. So that's something we have to bear in mind. When we look at the past, before we start getting all moralistic about it, we should look first at ourselves and see what it is we accept that our ancestors would not have. As moral judges, in my humble estimation, we're kind of low down on the totem pole. Because we take a lot of garbage that they would have not sat still for. So probably setting ourselves up as the end-all and be-all, I mean, it's fun. You feel good about yourself, which is, as good moderns, we know that's what life is really all about, just feeling good about yourself. But if you want anything beyond that, like truth or reality, then you've got to bear in mind that your presuppositions have been spoon-fed to you, and you know what you think you know because you're told you know it.
Mm.
And you don't necessarily. So, to return to the question, pardon my getting off track.
Oh no, that's what the show's for.
Well, I tell you, I tell people, sending me off on tangents, there's no sport to it. It's like shooting a goldfish in a bowl. I just squirrel. But at any rate, I digress. So again, the thing is that the president then, at the same time, has to somehow act as nonpartisan chief of state. Remember, I said he is, in a sense, the high priest of the American religion. So what do we find? He presides over days of mourning and prayer at the National Cathedral. He attempts to comfort the nation in times of crisis. One thing that a lot of my friends have across the political spectrum, and yes, I'm old enough to be able to have them across the political spectrum.
That's a second American heresy you've uttered.
I know. Well, see, I've always felt that individual human beings are more important than politics. I know. I'm sorry, I said it.
That's what I'm thinking, but I'm losing friends left and right, Charles.
Yeah, well, you got to hold on to them when you can. I mean, I'll put it this way. My best friend at the time, who's dead now, but my best friend at the time and I violently disagreed over the election of 1980. Now, if we had allowed that to come between us, he would have lived another 20 years with us disaffected. And does anybody really remember who ran in 1980?
I wasn't even alive.
That's my point. See how stupid it is losing something real like a friendship over a political issue? Because they're not worth it. And they don't care about you.
Yeah.
It's not as though you're breaking up with your pal over supporting this one or that one is going to help anybody. Least of all the person you think you're in favor of, who, as I say, you probably aren't going to remember, and at the very least, you'll be severely disappointed in. It's crazy. I mean, we have such a skewed, and again, it goes back to being a republic, because in a republic, everything becomes political. The space for non-political reality gets ever smaller. In a monarchy, presuming that the king is an effective force, because in a crowned republic like Britain or the Netherlands or Canada, unfortunately they've got a lot of the division that you'll find in a republic. But when you've got a truly apolitical head of state, whose purpose is to, as Franz Josef said to Theodore Roosevelt, protect my people from their politicians. Well, then the role of the monarch makes a lot of sense when he's the patron of the arts, he's patron of education, he's patron of hunting, patron of wildlife, patron of this, that. In other words, stop and think about it. All of the most important and enjoyable elements of life, from the very high, like religion, to the not so high, like sports, the king is patron of. And those things are where you actually live. That's where you spend most of your time. Politics per se, unless they're rioting in the streets and so forth, which is a different story. That's almost war. But normal politics, they really should not affect, in a decently run country, they should not affect the lives of the vast majority of people. And you shouldn't be willing to dump a long-standing friendship over something as ridiculous as the counting of snouts in an election. I mean, what could be more insane than losing a childhood friend because he supports moron A and you support moron B?
When we talk about Christendom, when we talk about kind of the strength of Catholic monarchy, and it seems to me like what I found out is just kind of reading about the Middle Ages in particular, is compared to our system nowadays, it's decentralized. So the idea is that the king might have a divine right to rule, but where now a president gets on, or he tweets, or enacts the courts, or whatever you have you, and it seems like it can affect wide sweeping change, it can end a friendship or anything. It doesn't seem like the boot of the king is actually very much felt. And I call them the Americanisms. But one of the things that I'm shedding even up until our revolution is that compared to how our system is designed now, if our ancestors went to war over specific taxes on things like tea, or no taxation without representation, I can't imagine how we didn't do anything for the passive income tax, or how, when coronavirus hit, the whole of the world got shut down here. People were out of the job, being fined and jailed for wanting to work. It doesn't seem, compared to the past, that we're doing much better in that sort of republic system. But yet we're all supposed to believe that we have a vote, we have a say. It doesn't seem like it.
Well, we have a say. You can say whatever you like. It just doesn't matter. You can say whatever you want. That's fine. I mean, unless you're in academia or media, in which case you lose your job. But there's a price to be paid for freedom. Well, the thing, too, to bear in mind, and this, since you touched on the Middle Ages, is a very important question. And that is the question of power versus authority. Very, very important. They're two very different things. Authority is the right to say what ought to happen. Power is the ability to make it so. So your doctor has the authority to prescribe the treatment for you, but he doesn't have the power to make you do it, although you have the power to do it. All right. So in the Middle Ages, authority was concentrated. It was concentrated in the church. It came from God. It was mediated through the church and symbolically via coronation, the rite of coronation, which was considered a sort of eighth sacrament, to the king. And the king had the authority. But power was very diffuse. The king had some. The church had some. The cities had some. The guilds had some. The lords had some. Even the peasants had some. We go back to Aristotle's mixed government. And a king, a good king, was like an orchestra leader, coordinating the different interests to work together for the good of the whole. If you had a bad king, and you certainly did have them, mind you, you also had a lot of royal saints. People forget that part. But you did have some really bad kings. And what happened when you had a bad king? Well, he could make life really unpleasant for the people immediately around him. That's true. But that was not the big threat to the realm. The threat to the realm was not despotism. It was anarchy. Because the medieval state did not have the appurtenances that we consider essential for government. They didn't have an income tax. They didn't have an internal revenue or a secret police. They didn't have any of that stuff. And the interesting thing was that, to a certain degree, the medieval state was kind of a mutually imagined construct amongst all the subjects. The typical example, and you can see this even in our remaining legal terms, the phrase "the peace." You've heard it, justice of the peace, keeping the peace, breaking the peace. Well, what does that mean? It means the king's peace, and it was literally considered to be the normal state of affairs. The justice of the peace enforced it. A breach of the peace, breaking the peace, meant violating the king's peace, and you would be punished. But the way it was done was very interesting. So, for instance, if you had a major highway, it was always the King's Highway. In California, of course, we have El Camino Real, which was a transplanting of the same concept, which the Spanish did a lot of. They had a number of these Caminos Reales in different places. But so you've got the King's Highway. Why is it called the King's Highway? Well, every so often there are stables, royal stables, the horses of the king's messengers go back and forth. That's why it's a King's Highway. And where a highwayman on a lesser road might get off with a fine if he was caught. If you were a robber on the King's Highway and you were caught, you were dead. But how did it work? Well, somebody's robbing people on the King's Highway, and all the locals get together. They sound the hue and cry. They go after him in the name of the king. These so-called posse comitatus. They grab the guy and they bring him to the justice of the peace. He's given a fair trial and strung up. So, well, I was kind of rough and ready in those days. There's a reason why people would try to get their cases heard in church courts rather than civil courts. But at any rate, the thing is that the king's peace then was seen as an almost palpable thing, and each of the subjects of the king were responsible for maintaining it wherever they were. And we still have the name, although we no longer have the idea. We still have the name in law. A lot of our laws like that. We still talk, for instance, about king's bench jurisdiction in American law, which means the right of a higher court to investigate or to intervene into the doings of a lesser court. We still call that king's bench jurisdiction, even though we haven't had a king's bench since the Revolution. So the thing is that we tend to forget where all this came from. And today, what has happened is that we live in precisely the reverse. Power is concentrated. It's concentrated in government, media, academia to a great degree, higher academia, of course. I'm not talking about your community college, but certainly the Ivy Leagues have a lot of power.
Right. Yeah.
Your community college just tries to imitate them. So instead of being a well-degreed stupid Marxists, they are just stupid Marxists. Anyway, the point is, I wish I'd stop interrupting myself. Anyway, the point is that power then is concentrated, but authority is diffuse amongst the people. And who are the people again? Well, nobody really knows. They could be anybody. All you know is if you do the wrong thing, you'll be punished.
Right.
If you don't believe me, light up in a restaurant and see what happens to you. Say the wrong thing. Use a racial epithet. I'm not in favor of using racial epithets, but don't pretend to me that you believe in free speech if you're going to be in favor of ostracizing people who use them. I mean, today, that sort of language gets the kind of punishment that in my day, foul language got. And see, here's the thing. I don't believe in freedom of language, in freedom of speech. I don't believe in it. I do not. I don't think you should be allowed to swear in front of women. I don't think you should be allowed to blaspheme in public. But see, I've told you up front, I don't believe in it. Our masters pretend they do, and that's what drives me crazy. And over here, and believe me, I know the Holocaust happened. I had enough relatives killed in it. But it drives me a little bit cray-cray that they criminalize Holocaust denial. Why? Do I like Holocaust deniers? No. But if you're going to criminalize something like that, do not pretend the way you're constantly yapping that you believe in free speech, because you don't. I don't. But, I would not criminalize historical errors. I mean, if I were, I'd have to arrest 4/5 of the history faculties in the United States. They'd all have to be go off to the Who's Cow. I mean, imagine the poor people at Harvard stuck in the Cambridge County Jail. Very sad.
Rudy, do you remember the other day? What was it you were talking about? Like legislation of morality and like what it means for a government to do or not to do. Something along the lines of. Okay, so the question is perfect for a monarch, right? So if the idea is like, does the monarch, especially a Catholic monarch, what obligation does he have towards the promulgation or protection of the Catholic faith in relations to other religions, other ideas, people who are his subjects but might not share the king's?
Oh yes, the context of this. Yeah, the context of this is that we were looking at Dignitatis Humanae, and we were trying to suss out the objections that the society had towards the document. And so we were reading initially just a few chapters of the beginning and comparing it to the objections as the Society of St. Pius X had. And we saw within this like a big conversation about well, how is it, how, in a Catholic monarchy, for example, how would it function if you had other subjects that were not Catholic within the realm?
Well, a lot would depend upon the direct circumstances. See, one of the great things about monarchy is that it's very flexible, and it's in a position to adjust to realities as they face them.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you have a country that is already primarily Catholic, and there are very few non-Catholics,
mm-hmm.
it's quite easy. You just don't allow them to proselytize or advertise their services.
Okay.
But by the same token, the king has not a supernatural obligation, because the Catholic king does have a supernatural obligation to his subjects to protect them from heresy, the way your father does. He has that obligation. Now, people of other faiths, he does have an obligation to them, a natural obligation. And how does he deal with that? Well, the answer is it's always been a case-by-case basis.
Mm-hmm.
The church teaches that error has no rights, but the enforcement of any given law depends upon its utility. In other words, I don't mean to be utilitarian, but if enforcing something rigidly would cause greater evils than not, you don't. So to put this another way, I may have the right to your house, okay? I actually own the lease. But it so happens that you and your pregnant wife and your 16 children are living there. And if I exercise my right, you're going to be out on the street. And as it so happens, because you're not a very nice person, none of your relatives and nobody else will take you in.
Mm-hmm.
So while I have the absolute right to throw you out, I probably shouldn't. Because the greater evil, i.e. your wife and children being homeless, especially your pregnant wife, would result from my exercising my perfectly legitimate right. Another example of this kind of moral thinking, you own a bread shop. I'm starving. Now, my right to self-preservation is higher than your right to property. So I can steal a loaf of bread if I really am starving. But I can't empty the cash register. You see, there's a difference.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I have to be really starving. That's the other thing. Well, I mention all this by way of laying the groundwork. Because while the church does not believe that error has rights, and moreover considers in a Catholic country the idea of non-Catholic faiths being given equal rights with her is wrong. At least that's what it always was until Vatican II. Nevertheless, she has tolerated certain arrangements. So, for instance, when James II, the brother of Charles II, became King of England in 1685, with papal approval, he was crowned in an Anglican coronation rite and became the head of the Church of England and the head of the Church of Scotland. The Catholic kings of Saxony and Bavaria and the Austrian emperor were actually the heads of the Protestant religion in their realms. But those religions were not allowed to proselytize. And for a very long time, they were not allowed to advertise their worship services or have buildings that were obviously churches.
Mm.
And that's the way it was in Franco, Spain. Now, this sounds very, very radical and strange to us because we're not used to thinking of religion as actually true. But we do, like every other society, punish ideologies that we think are bad. And we punish those who hold them. I cite again Holocaust denial. Here, you will go to jail if you deny the Holocaust. Now, whether or not you should or should not be able to is beside the point. The point is that the state sees Holocaust denial as a doctrine that is dangerous to public order.
Mm-hmm.
And so it criminalizes it. Every society does. When I was young, they did their best to suppress communism, and pornography was made very, very difficult. Because that's what societies do. In a Catholic society, heresies are considered evils that one way or the other have to be kept in their place. Now, a lot depends on how many people have that heresy as to whether or not what your measures are going to be. Mm-hmm. And again, also their behavior. That's the other thing. Because in the countries I mentioned, not in Britain, but in Austria, in Saxony and Bavaria, the Protestants, although small minorities, and not Saxony, but Bavaria and Austria, small minorities, nevertheless, they proved themselves loyal to the king and pillars of order. So the more they proved that, the better off they were. In earlier days, when they were conspiring with the king's enemies, well, then they were like communists. In Austria, in particular, the Protestants here were the natural allies of the Prussians. So they were like a fifth column. Well, what do you do with that? I don't know. Ask the Japanese in World War II, who, by the way, did not deserve it. That was one of the funny things. This is totally outside the question, but it's worth mentioning. President Roosevelt had wondered about the loyalty of Japanese Americans before the war. So he commissioned this fellow, who's a wealthy businessman, to look into it. And he did, and he made a report. His report found that by and large, with very, very few exceptions, Japanese Americans had transferred their intense loyalty to the emperor to the United States, mm-hmm. in almost exactly the same way. And so, while there were many examples of German and Italian Americans favoring or even aiding the Axis during World War II, there was not one of a Japanese in the Western United States. Not one. And Franklin Roosevelt knew it when he sent them to camps. Not a fun story, but at any rate, the point I'm making. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say. Well, it makes not necessarily sense, but I think to kind of the point, it's that you don't have to, because it's true. It's like there are, obviously we know that of like not all the Jewish ghettos in different parts of the empires, whether it's in Rome or in Spain or something, were just always routinely cleaned out, 1492 notwithstanding or something. So we do know that you can have a difference of religious group or cultural group inside your kingdom, but there is a sort of a desire still for a monarch to see to the protection of his peoples as long as they remain good subjects. Would that be fair?
Exactly. And it was interesting, as far as we could take three groups, or two anyway, the Jews and the Gypsies. Now, it was interesting in the ghettos, the medieval ghettos, people forget that they were actually ruled by the rabbis. The minute you set foot into a ghetto, you were a Gentile. You were stuck with rabbinical law, because that was what governed the life of the ghetto. Now, it is true that leaving that setup was a great inducement to conversion for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, it's important to bear in mind that they ran their own affairs. Similarly, when the Gypsies first showed up in Europe in the 1300s, they were originally from India. Nobody knew what to do with these strange people who just arrived, were doing all sorts of things. But they were able to get a writ of protection from the Holy Roman Emperor. And they came under his direct protection. So whenever they were threatened, they'd whip out a copy of the decree and say, leave us alone.
We're under king's law.
Yep. If you've got a problem with us, take it up with the emperor. Don't bother us. Now, interestingly enough, too, and this goes back to the flexibility of monarchy with specific situations. One of the great, to my way of thinking, miracles of governance was the Spanish rule from California to Argentina for 2.5 centuries after the conquest. We always think about the conquest and how horrible it was and all that. Well, our views of that are somewhat skewed. But once that was done, the Spanish did a lot of interesting things. Firstly, they had a minimum of military force. They had virtually nothing in the way of policing. It was all self-done. the Spanish dominions were divided in two, the Republic of the Spanish and the Republic of the Indians. And what that meant was that the Indian towns and regions were all under their own rulers, the caciques. And many of these people became Spanish noblemen. To this day, in Spain, they're descendants of the Aztec and Inca emperors who were members of the Spanish nobility.
Interesting.
Yeah, and they had Indian professors in Spanish universities and things like that. Beyond that, though, because the territories were so varied and so very, very, very different, the Council of the Indies in Sevilla would pass an order, the king would approve it. The law would go to the New World, but the local governor of every province would examine the new decree. And if he did think it was really going to work, according to local conditions, he would send a response, and the response was beautiful. It said, "I obey, but I do not execute."
Oh.
Now, when he did that, what would happen is that an anonymous visitador would be sent to that province and would look around and would decide for himself if, in fact, man's right. This just isn't going to fly here.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was his decision, then the governor was fine. But if, on the other hand, he said, the guy there are problems here, well, then the governor would be out of a job. So the governor was basically, if he did that, this was a nuclear option. It was the make or break thing. If he really didn't know what he was doing, it would be the end of his career. And, you talk about checks and balances, which are an important feature of our system, or supposed to be anyway.
That's good accountability.
Accountability is what the checks and balances are supposed to provide, is very, very important to make any system run.
Mm-hmm.
And the Spanish were masters at it. You play, as it were, one end against the middle in order to ensure equity.
That brings to mind also the quality of the person that was required to do that job. It probably would have to be someone with a discerning eye, to be able to say, oh, well, this will definitely stand here, and then if not, I'm sorry, but I don't know how it can make that work.
Yep. And the thing is, you've got to bear in mind that these people all had classical educations.
Mm-hmm.
They knew their Latin and Greek, and beyond that, they had acquired the habit of learning. I mean, that's why you look at these people, not just Spanish, but Portuguese, French, British, Dutch, in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, they went all over the world, and they built roads and dams and things like that without being trained in it. Well, how did they do that? Well, they did it because, having had classical educations, they knew how to learn things if they needed to learn them. I don't know how to build a dam. So I'll learn how. I'll learn how to build a dam, and then they would learn. I mean, mind you, the specialization that's so much a part of the modern world has had certain strengths. It certainly pushed our technology, into the stratosphere.
Mm-hmm.
But it also has certain defects. So one of them is that when you're so specialized in one area, you really don't know anything else about anything else, but you think you do. And there's no worse combination than arrogance and ignorance.
Mm-hmm.
I could tell stories, but the point is that one of the problems, you might say, with real Republican government is that it does encourage this kind of specialization. The monarch has to be jack of all trades, even if he's master of none. He's got to have some sort of interest in the arts, some sort of interest in science.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at all of the academies of art and the academies of science in Europe, they're all founded by kings.
Yeah.
And they were founded by kings who had an actual interest in them. It's interesting that in our country, and this goes back once more to the difficulty of the president having to be at once high priest and apolitical chief of state, is that certainly since Roosevelt's time, and to some degree different times before, they have tried to take on this role of patron of arts and learning that, on the one hand, is absolutely natural to a head of state, but on the other hand, constitutionally makes no sense in our system. So you have things like the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, but because they're not really governed by anyone's single taste, they go all over the place.
Yeah.
I mean, the intention is proper. The intention is very good. I have to say, I'm not a big fan of Roosevelt or JFK, but it's interesting to note that our three presidents who were the most involved in this side of the thing were also the three who were considered the most regal in manner. FDR, JFK, Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
And that is because, for whatever reason, on some level, they understood that a great nation needs to encourage these things. Even though, if you were a strict constitutionalist, you'd have to say there's really no place for the government to be involved.
The melding of on the constitutional issue, because I know in Star Spangled Crown, one thing that's very interesting is, you talked about this prior, it's not just an absolute monarchy that comes and takes over. It's in Star Spangled Crown, it's a melding of the American Constitution. There's a keeping of the Bill of Rights, if I remember correctly, but it's also a bringing in of the understanding of how the king appoints, how the king is going to govern the Council of 100 or whatever it was that was assembled. What is your estimation of, in terms of how monarchy looks, or what would probably be the best sort of fit? Is it constitutional monarchy? Is it a sort of more medieval system where there's power to the guilds and to the estates and that sort of thing? What does it look like?
Well, see, that's the theory. The theory behind constitutional monarchy, like Britain, like the Netherlands, and so forth, is that you've got a limited monarchy wherein you have a mixed government, and so on. Now, that was certainly the case at the time of the American Revolution, and certainly under the Stuart kings. It is not the case now, because it's no longer a mixed government. I mean, and I'm going to say something that's going to sound very unkind, and I don't mean it to, because to this day, these constitutional monarchs still perform a useful task, a shadow of what their forebears had and did. But still, their countries would all be worse off without them. And you know, by the same token, there are monarchies I would never want to live under. The Ottoman Sultan, the Manchu emperors. But by that token, they were never replaced by anything better. I may not have wanted to live under the Sultan, but I wouldn't have been able to live under Ataturk. You know, I might not have really liked life under the Chinese emperor, but I surely couldn't have lived under Mao. So, I mean, you know, we have to get a bit of proportion here. So similarly, there is no existing constitutional monarchy today that would be improved by becoming a republic. But fortunately, because their wings are so clipped, and they've been so reduced, they can't provide for their peoples many of the benefits that their forebears could. Franz Joseph, the Emperor of Austria, I mentioned it earlier, but it's a good thing to meditate on, as it were. Theodore Roosevelt came to visit him after he retired from the presidency. And he asked him, well, you know, what do you feel your role as a modern monarch is? And Franz Joseph said, protecting my people from their politicians. And that is precisely what the modern constitutional monarchy cannot deliver. Except in in the most extreme of cases. It's interesting that in the Commonwealth, Canada, Australia, the Crown Commonwealth, the Queen is still Queen, but although those countries are independent of Britain completely, the Queen remains the sovereign. But as in Britain, the politicians run everything. However, there is a vice-regal official appointed at the advice of the Prime Minister of the day. So although he represents the Queen, he holds office usually at the pleasure of the Prime Minister, the chief politico. Nevertheless, from time to time, when things have gotten very bad in those countries, the vestigial reserve powers, as they're called, have been exercised. This was true in Canada in 1926, when the the Prime Minister at the time in Canada, Mackenzie King, wanted the government dissolved because the Royal Commission was about to expose how corrupt his government were. And that is now a Royal Commission's life ends with the end of the government that appointed him. So to avoid that happening, he asked the Governor General to dissolve Parliament, which is the way it's done. Governor General, Lord Byng, who had commanded Canadians in World War I, which is why he got the job, he said no. He knew exactly what Mackenzie King was trying to do. I'm not going to do that. So then he went to the opposition to see if they would patch together a government that would last long enough to allow the commission to finish. They agreed to it. He refused to call for new elections, but in the end, one of the parties backed out. The government collapsed, and he had to do it anyway. But this was a big scandal, and it ruined Lord Byng's career. Similar thing in 1972 in Australia, when Gough Whitlam lost control of the Senate, which in Australia, unlike most of the other Commonwealth countries, has almost equal powers with the lower house. So if they refuse to finance the government, you're stuck. You can't pass it over. Yeah. And that's what happened. So when Whitlam refused to call for no elections, and he said he was going to start financing the government through loans and stuff, which was a complete violation of the Constitution. Well, like the sovereign he represents, the Governor General is the supreme guardian of the Constitution. And so he gave Whitlam every chance to ask him to call for new elections. He wouldn't do it, so he dismissed him. And it destroyed him politically. And of course, that is the thing about the reserve powers. Any Governor General that uses them knows it's the end of his career. It's the nuclear option. You only do it because not doing anything is so much worse. And they say that the Governor General's job, like that of the Queen, is to ensure that there's a government in office. But that's all great, and it has prevented certain extraordinary horrors from going on. But it doesn't do any good most of the time. Because usually, just as in our country, the horrors the governments want to perpetrate upon their peoples are within the letter of the law. Mm-hmm. And there is no living person to say no. In our system, the Constitution, in a sense, occupies the place of the king. But the Constitution is a piece of paper. And the only people who have the quote-unquote right to interpret it, at least the way the system has evolved, are the oracles of Delphi that we call the Supreme Court. And it doesn't matter how, even if it contradicts the letter of the Constitution, if their high mightinesses sign off on it, it's the law of the land, and you're stuck, moron. Live with it. Eat it. You don't have a choice. Yeah. And practically speaking, they are not responsible to anyone. It's, G.K. Chesterton, who it would be very difficult to call either a Republican or a monarchist, simply because he saw the problems with both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He said, one thing you have to understand, he said, above all, is that monarchy is a personal form of government. A republic is an impersonal form of government. And so I guess a big part of the question is how human you want your rulers to be. I know in our country we like to say that we're a nation of ruled by laws, not men. But that's not true.
No.
It can't ever really be true. Because what is the law? It is, in our system, it's whatever our masters tell us it is. And they change their minds. Mm-hmm. In 1890, United States versus Trinity Church, the Supreme Court ruled that these United States are a Christian country. And they gave all sorts of reasons, in addition to the law, as to why this was so. What's interesting is that the vast majority of the things they cited have not changed. And yet successive courts have said, oh, no, it's not a Christian country. So who's on first?
What?
No, he's on second.
I don't know.
He's third base. So that is the real problem that faces us. You see, part of the problem with our kind of government is it denies two definite realities. One is the whole state church thing I spoke of much earlier. The second problem is that every human society has the rulers and the ruled. The rulers are always the minority, the ruled are always the majority. Statistically speaking, wherever you are, wherever you live, you will probably not have much of a say in the course of your life, at least that part of it that belongs to the government to play with you on. I know that's a hard saying, but it's true. Now, the problem with our system is that it veils these two realities. It covers them up. And as a result, several things happen. Number one, when people begin to realize, having been fed on a steady diet of, well, the people rule and you matter and so on and so forth, eventually when they find out one way or another that they don't matter and they have no control over the way things are done, they begin to imagine all sorts of arcane conspiracies that have taken away your power. Your power wasn't taken away. You never had any. Don't be silly. You never had any control. You don't decide on your income tax. You never got to vote on the internal revenue. You said earlier about the internal revenue of the revolution. One of the founding fathers, I forget who it was, said in 1793 or something like that, we were never so free of taxes as under the king. Well, careful what you pray for. Or as my late father used to say, give them what they want, good and hard. But the thing is that reality has been hidden. So not only do people get very resentful when they realize that it's not the way I was taught, but the rulership themselves become irresponsible because they're to a great degree invisible. Under a monarchy, especially a mixed sort of a setup where, yes, you've got the king, but you've got all sorts of local people and so forth. Well, you know whose feet to kiss or whose windows to throw rocks through, depending on what's going to work at that given moment. There is responsibility, but there is none in our system. And you are seeing it now in spades. Voltaire, I hate quoting him, but he had a wonderful quote. It is amazing how long rotten things can last as long as they're not handled roughly. Unfortunately, our system right now is being handled rather roughly. And the rot is becoming apparent.
Yeah.
And the rot's everywhere. It's in academia. It's in the church. It's in the state. It's in the mayors and city councils who don't seem to know what police are for. I got to tell you, police are by their nature kind of rough, tough people, and they have very difficult jobs to do. But more whites die at their hands every year than blacks.
Mm-hmm.
People don't go on about that. There was an interesting interview. They're having these demonstrations now over the Minneapolis murder in Melbourne. Minneapolis murder in Melbourne. Oh, never mind. Australia. And this Indian Australian went around interviewing people, asking them if they'd ever heard of Jacqueline Diamond. And nobody had. I'm sure you haven't. I hadn't until I saw the video. Jacqueline Diamond, a couple of years ago, was an Australian tourist lady who was in her nightgown, was told to stop by a policeman in Minneapolis, same police department, a black policeman. He told her to stop. She didn't, and he shot her dead. Now, there were no riots all over Australia, were there? They didn't pull out their ambassador. They didn't demand compensation. So you see, regardless of the other issues, we are pretty messed up. We really are. We don't know our rear ends from our elbows or our excrement from shoe polish. You see, I've just translated into pleasant terms old vulgarities of my youth.
These are the ones that would have been banned, correct?
No, I would have. You bet. That's right. Not now. Now I could say them and be fine. And they go, oh, yeah, that's right. The free speech movement, man. You can sound like a real moron. Yeah. Yeah, okay, great. Yeah. If you want to be low class, pal, I'm the one to come to. All right, fine. But, and there you see is another thing, too. One of the things that has happened in our society, and this is really, what's the word I want? Accelerated since the 60s, but it was happening already. A monarch gives you something to look up to, and one hopes an example. So what do you have? Well, you look at old pictures, you see workmen on the sides of the road in three-piece suits. I'm not recommending you wear three-piece suits while working in a mine or a pit the way they did. But what I'm saying is, even the poorest among us aspired to be better than they were. Now you've got millionaires paying tons of money for pre-ripped jeans.
Mm-hmm.
You know what, pal? I'll rip your jeans for the amount of money. The amount of money you pay that to me, and I'll take a pair of bloody Levi's and rip them up for you. How's that? And they'll be Levi's by Coulombe. $6,000 a pair, incidentally.
I'd wear them.
Out here in Los Angeles, that's a hot ticket.
Yeah, I know. Stupid is good.
It seems like it's the, at least in our systems we devise it today, and maybe it's the danger of our republic moving towards things like mob rule. Because genuinely speaking, the concepts of justice, law, right, and who holds that sort of thing, what we don't see is that we don't see it embodied in maybe the way that you would just by the idea of your monarch being your statesman. We don't call our presidents or our governors or anybody statesmen, to one of your earlier points.
No.
There has been a loss of classical education. There has been a loss of, in a monarchy, there does seem to be, it's divine right means that there's an obligation that the king has to God to govern properly.
Yeah.
And that's a dereliction of duty. But we don't even talk about dereliction of duty anymore. Your duty is just to whoever voted you in.
Whoever voted you in.
Yeah.
And of course, the fellow I just wrote about, Blessed Emperor Charles, despite what he was put through, on his deathbed, he said, I am suffering and dying for my peoples, that they come back together. Now, the idea of the head of state being willing to sacrifice his life for his people, and you see it not just with Catholics. I mean, certainly you did with Blessed Emperor Karl, you saw it with Louis XVI. You read his last will, and he hopes that his blood will not curse his people, but bring about their peace. I mean, gosh, could you imagine a president on his way to being executed saying that? He'd be cursing them.
Uh-huh. I do have, as we wrap down, there's just one final question that I know some have been dying to ask. But who are the examples of the best Catholic monarchs? Who are the kings or queens that you would have loved to live under? And as monarchists are starting to pop up all over the place, whom we should start looking into their histories and aspiring to figure out what a better system of governance is for the church and for state.
All right. Well, of course, any king with a saint before his name or
King
her
Louis
name
forever.
St. Louis IX is a good one. St. Henry the Emperor. If they've got saint before their name, they would generally
Probably all right.
Pretty okay guys. Certainly Blessed Emperor Karl, King Louis XVI, his brother Charles X, Franz Joseph. I mean, the only Habsburg I wouldn't have wanted to live under was Joseph II. He was not one of my faves, although Mozart flourished under him. The czars of Russia. Well, Nicholas II was kind of a martyr in a sense, the way Charles I was in England. Yeah. And certainly Charles I in England is one of my favorites as well. James II. Queen Mary I, so-called Bloody Mary. Not to be confused with Bloody Betsy. Mm-hmm. Henry VI was a saint, seemingly. Mary Queen of Scots I like, although I wouldn't have liked to live under her times. Some of these people, you wouldn't have wanted to live there in terms of a peaceful life, but you sure wish you could have stood by them,
Yeah.
Let me see. And Italy, there were a couple of kings of Naples who were pretty neat, and kings of Sardinia, Charles Emmanuel, Charles Victor Emmanuel I. Spanish kings, well, of course, Charles V, the great emperor. You know, he was like Philip II.
Lepanto forever.
I'm sorry?
Lepanto forever.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, although he had some problems, we all have to venerate the great King Carlos III of Spain, who had been King of Naples before and founded the Teatro San Carlo. And before that was the Duke of Parma. So he founded the Bourbon of Two Sisters, Bourbon Parma. But he did the most astonishing, amazing thing any monarch of any faith across the planet ever did. The greatest contribution to world civilization and to everyone's welfare, collectively. It's just such an amazing triumph of human spirit and will. Such an extraordinary thing. He founded Los Angeles.
Woo!
See?
That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, his statue is.
Yes. What war could any monarch have done?
Oh.
He was my great uncle.
If the Mormons are right, when Christ was in America, he must have pre-founded LA.
Jeez.
Well, I don't want people to think we Angelinos are full of ourselves or anything.
Never.
It's not that we're narcissistic.
Not I.
No. I'm sorry. Was I saying something?
Oh, right. Well, Charles, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. We'll have to certainly have you back. If you liked what he had to say, you can follow Charles along. You can get your books, I know, at tumblrhouse.com, who is your publisher. You can also find them on Amazon, which I've just ordered a slew for all my good little Angelino friends out here. Where else are your writings, Charles? Where else is a good place for people to find your work and your lecture series and all that good jazz?
Oh boy. Well, you can find some of my early stuff on Theodore Harvey's royalty site. You can find the American Thinker has some of my stuff. I used to write for the Taki Mag. They have a lot of articles by me. Catholicism.org has a lot of my articles. And of course, Tan Books is also a publisher of mine. They, my last book they brought out, and that was on the Holy Grail, which I was very, very happy with. I love things Arthurian. It would be strange if I didn't, frankly. But one of my editors at I write for the Catholic Herald and I write for Crisis magazine. And my current editor, Crisis, Mike Davis, years ago wrote an article which you can find online called "Why I Am a Monarchist." He's one too, and it was interesting because toward the end of it, he says, actually, everyone is monarchist when they're young. We grow up thinking of kings and queens and princes and princesses and fairy tales. So the real question you should ask yourself is not, why am I a monarchist? But when did you yourself stop being one?
Yeah. Yeah.
When, and I'll enlarge it, when did you decide it was okay to settle for what we've got? Now, I must emphasize one other quick point, and that is, I don't advocate, as I say, a great revolution or anything like that, precisely because the last thing I'd want to do is have what we have right now. But I can say that Catholic institutions developed out of the conversion of Europe to Catholicism when the native institutions were converted and improved. And the result was Catholic Monarchy. Out of that encounter between America and the faith, something good will develop. The scenario I give in Star Spangled Crown is, I don't think it's terribly likely. It'd be nice, but I wouldn't bet the farm on it. I might bet the lives of all the leaders of mobs and current unpleasantness on it, but I wouldn't bet anything else. And I'm sure all the shopkeepers would match that bet. And that reminds me of one other point I'll make, and then I'm done. Not really the monarchy, but the present problems. I used to be the sole white columnist in a black magazine in Louisiana called Creole of Lafayette. Unfortunately, it's not online, so you can't get my articles that way. But it was a great magazine to write for. My editrix, Ruth Foote, I still know her. She's brilliant, but unfortunately, she's no longer in the business. A real loss, if you ask me. But at any rate, she asked me to do something after the 1992 riots, which I did. I ended it with this question, and I would like everyone out there, especially if they've been involved in the festivities of the past week or two. Here it is. How oppressed do I have to be before you think it's okay for me to burn your house or your business? Think carefully about that. And I think if you do think carefully, you will find that it wouldn't matter if I was being beaten to a pulp. You would never think it was okay for me to burn you out. And if it makes you feel any better, I agree with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much again for being on. We very much appreciate it. For everybody out who have been listening, of course, we just gave where you can find all Charles's work, and you can follow along with the Glad Trad Podcast here on YouTube. We also have our Twitter at Glad Trad Podcast. You can see all of our podcasts all over the interwebs. Even Charles is. I know that you do your Off the Menu with Victor Franchini. That's
Don
on
Vincenzo. We
Vincenzo.
call him Don Vincenzo. We're very careful. We don't, you don't really want to upset my producer. He's a very nice.
No, I don't want to ruin it with the suits also at Tumblr House, as we hear from time to time.
Well, see, it's what you call a double whammy. The suits will arrive with briefcases full of subpoenas, and then on the other hand, the other side of the family will be, Mr. Pacheco, it's a nice home you've got there. It'd be terrible if something happened to it.
Oh, no, not the farm. All right, well, from all of us here, everybody, please take care. God bless you. Mary keep you. We'll see you on the next one. Adios.
God bless all. Bye-bye.